Hi, I'm Greg Schinkel, President of Unique Training and Development and Frontline Leadership Systems, and I'm here with our General Manager, Kirk Langford, and on the Leader Feeder podcast, which is the OG podcast, the original podcast. I think I recorded about 250 episodes of the podcast and then turned it over to Kirk as the General Manager and also Suzanne Jakes, who is our marketing coordinator, and the two of them have been really changing the format and evolving it. And what we want to do is kind of look back on episodes from the last year. I know as a person who consumes it as well in the car as I'm driving, just how much I like the banter that you and Suzanne have. And this is our chance to look back over some of the episodes and how informative that they were.
Well, thank you for that. I was going to say, Suzanne, you cut your hair or something. You look a little bit different. No, we've really enjoyed it, and I for listeners or watchers that have been tuned into Leader Feeder for a while, they've noticed that it went from sort of you talking to the camera, and then of course we've moved it into a bit more of an interview style. And I think the neat thing about moving to an interview style is you get into some really good conversations that you might not otherwise get into if you're just by yourself. So it's been a really interesting, I guess, adventure, an interesting experience. And she and I really have a good time just thinking of what do we want to talk about? What's helpful to people? What's relevant to frontline leaders? So we enjoy that.
You've actually, I've loved watching the evolution of the podcast because, like you said, we changed the format of it, but we also, what was different is way back, if you go back to watch the very early episodes, they were really around just straight up leadership tips. And then we realized that our audience is a bit broader. We have a lot of HR professionals, a lot of learning and development professionals, and yes, a lot of managers and supervisors. And so some of the concepts that you're going into really do, I think, a deeper dive into the challenges like in supply chain, logistics, manufacturing. Yeah. And so I just enjoy listening to them on my drive.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I appreciate that. And you're right. We have changed our focus a little bit, and sometimes we're always looking at it. We're always shifting, going, are we hitting the target? Because, of course, you want to provide still practical tips for frontline leaders. But like you said, we do have a bigger audience, HR managers, L&D folks who, appreciate some other topics as well, or looking at things from maybe a different perspective. And, for example, the first clip we're going to talk about, of course, is from our Developing Future Leaders in Your Warehouse, which, again, is we are providing practical tips, but we're also looking at some sort of higher level stuff, I guess you might say. What we're going to do, as you mentioned, we're going to look back at a few clips, and really these were based on episodes and sort of shorts or clips that were quite popular from our audience. So it was neat to see what the audience was finding interesting, finding helpful. And so, we thought, why don't we take a look at what they've either commented on the most or engaged with the most, because clearly that's resonating, and that's something that we wanted to look back at.
Right. So I've been fortunate to do the Accelerating Operational Performance podcast, but I think both you and Suzanne have got the most fun with the best name, which is the Leader Feeder podcast. So I'm looking forward to digging into some of these clips.
Yeah. So as I mentioned with that first one, it's from our Developing Future Leaders Within Your Warehouse. And really this first one started to talk about curiosity and how helping others actually matters when you're looking for good traits in a leader.
I think another good sign is to look for the teachers, right? So the people that like to help other people when they're struggling, when they need instruction. I mean, being a good teacher doesn't always mean that you'll be a good leader per se, but I do think that it's a starting point. So people that tend to help others without being asked, right? So you're working on a machine that I've worked on before. You've just started it. I noticed that you're struggling. And so I go over and I help you. And I say, hey, when you're doing that, I would try it this way. That can sometimes cause the machine to clog. Maybe think about this, or don't forget about that. Maybe I remind you of some PPE stuff to think about. Any of those tips, pointers, reminders tend to be, I think, a good sign for a leader that they're looking out for other people on their team. They're trying to help not just look after themselves, but the others on the team. So
yeah, and I mean, it was great because you were really being asked the question, how does a supervisor in a warehouse, act more supportive towards their team when they're struggling a bit? And I always think, like, even though it might have said warehouse in the title, I think this thing applies whether you're on a manufacturing floor or probably even in an office environment.
Yeah.
Anytime that you're trying to train someone up on a new job, or you just notice that they're struggling, because what people want from their leader more than anything else is probably this understanding, this support. People aren't trying to mess up. They just do sometimes, and they need to know that the leader has their back. Plus, I think it probably connects to empowerment as well.
Yeah, oh, for sure. Because I think what you're looking at is you can't really be empowered to take on a task or an assignment or a role if people aren't willing to give you the information you need to be successful in that role. So if no one's going to take the time to teach or train you, how can you be expected to succeed in that role with other than go ahead and try it and mess up inevitably? That's not the right way to do it. And I think what you get from someone who is maybe what I'd sort of call a natural teacher, or someone that just, like in the clip, tends to notice people who need help and is willing to give them that help, they empower, because it goes from, I didn't know how to use that machine, I didn't know how to use that piece of equipment, or I didn't know how to complete that task, to this person has taught me, now I can take it on. And so that's a really great empowerment feeling for the team member. For the leader, as we've talked about you've talked about it on the AOP podcast, the Accelerating Operational Performance, and we've talked about it on Leader Feeder a lot, this idea of leaders get burdened often with doing their team's tasks, right? Doing the tasks of their team members. And so if you can empower your people, they feel good because they're going, I can do this. My boss trusts me to do this. But then also you have more time to do what you need to do as a leader, right?
Yeah, two things come to mind. One is that when you really look at employee turnover, why employees make the decision to leave an organization, one of the main things is that and what shows up in employee surveys, is that they don't feel supported by their manager. There was nobody there to help them through their struggles. Mm-hmm. And if I feel like I'm on my own, and my leader doesn't care enough to provide some of the support when they see me struggling, then I might as well go look for a job somewhere else, or I'll stay, but I'll be miserable. Either one is not a great outcome. The other thing that you drew a connection there is that, we have this leadership progression model where we talk about people kind of moving up from being buddies to being supervisors. Yep. But then the next two tiers are like a hero leader who's always answering the questions and solving all the problems, and moving from hero to coach. And at the coach level, you're really making heroes of your team. And the only way you can really make heroes of your team is to provide them with the level of support that they need to be successful.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And part of that support changes the longer someone's on your team, and depending on how long they're in a role, right? If I've been around for 6 months, I probably need a lot more support, but not necessarily a lot of empowerment at that point. It might be more about really watching me, making sure I'm understanding, making sure I'm not making too many mistakes, or if I am, those are getting corrected in a constructive way. But then a year out, a year and a half, 2 years, your support as my leader has to change, right? It has to become, for example, more delegating, more giving me challenges to keep me excited and enthusiastic about the work. So support, it's interesting because support is such a broad word. And in one way that could be seen as a bad thing. But I actually think it's a really good thing, because as a leader, you need to be recognizing where each of your employees are in their journey, and with a specific task or role, and how much support do they need, and what does that support look like based on where they are in their journey.
Yeah, so that brings to mind the concept that at least I heard first from Ken Blanchard of the Blanchard Corporation. Ken Blanchard was, some of the more seasoned folks in the audience will probably remember that he was the 1 Minute Manager. He wrote a series of books on that. But what Blanchard really says around situational leadership that connects to what you said is that when someone is new to a task, when their proficiency on a task, doesn't matter how long they've worked in the department or in the company, but their task proficiency is low, they need more direction. And then as they start to get a little bit more competent at the task, they need the leader to go from being directive to being supportive. But a lot of leaders only really use one mode or another. Either they tend to be deep end leaders, which is like, you'll succeed, go get them, or they probably go the other way and they micromanage too much and they're always constantly telling people what to do. And we're really talking about support being in between those two.
Yeah, that's right. I guess it really comes back to that idea of, like you said, situational leadership, and that idea that your leadership style has to adapt and evolve as your employees do. So to think that, I once saw this image, and I think it's kind of telling in this situation. It's a mother hen sitting on an egg. Well, that's what it's supposed to do. That makes perfect sense. In the next frame of the little comic, it's a mother hen sitting on a baby chick, and you're kind of like, oh, that would hurt. And then it's a mother hen sitting on a full-grown chicken. So if you don't change your role, if you don't change your approach, if you don't change the support you give, what used to be useful and helpful is going to be, like you said, micromanaging and not providing
and
empowerment.
You're stifling people, literally.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's a great analogy.
Yeah. So if we talk about our next clip, this was from our Impact of Effective Leadership on Manufacturing Performance. And I like that because first of all, what the AOP podcast is all about, of course, is performance, accelerating operational performance. That's really what it focuses on. But in Leader Feeder, we do look at performance a little bit as well. So it was neat to do this episode because it almost felt a bit like a crossover because we're thinking of performance through good leadership and effective leadership. And so what we were talking about there is as the clip says, I get to attribute to you because one thing you told me early on is the two best attributes of a leader are self-awareness and curiosity.
And then the other two big ones that I would say, the owner of Unique Training and Development, Greg Schinkel, when I first started, he mentioned me these two things. He said, I think the two biggest traits above all are self-awareness and curiosity. And he said, I think it's self-awareness because self-awareness is the thing that as a leader makes you go, how good am I as a leader? Do my people like my leadership approach? Am I effective as a leader? And it also makes you kind of want to strive to be better because you kind of know what you need to work on. And then curiosity is the part that goes, okay, I know what I'm good at and I know what I'm not good at. Curiosity is the part that then makes you say, how do I get better at the things I'm not as good at? And really, I think everything comes from there. So then whether it's I need to get better at communication, giving constructive feedback, managing conflict, whatever it might be, all of it kind of comes from that sense of having a self-awareness of where your strengths and weaknesses are, and then the curiosity of wanting to learn to get better.
I mean, there you have it. It's such a great piece of information. I should mention, if you're watching the full episode, of course, that was a kind of an overlay of you teaching in the background, the one and only Greg Schinkel himself. But it's something that you told me early on when I started. I actually think it was maybe in my first couple of weeks, if I remember correctly. And I think about that all the time because one of the things we talk about in our course, the Frontline Leadership Program, is trying to find a definition for leadership and good leadership. And as we explain in the course, I mean, spoiler alert, but what we talk about in the course is that there is no finite definition of leadership. But I really think this idea of self-awareness and curiosity being two really good or strong attributes of a leader maybe gets close to maybe a finite definition in a very succinct way. And so one thing we should mention as well is that if you're interested in seeing the rest of that episode or any of the episodes that we're referring to today, all of those will be linked in the show notes, so anybody can check those out. And we hope that people do, of course, because I think there's lots of good nuggets in any of our episodes. But Greg, I wanted to ask you, since I've got you here, I wanted to know, where did that come from for you, this idea of self-awareness and curiosity? I mean, some leadership ideas you sort of hear from someone else. Some you wake up in the middle of the night and you have that eureka moment and you go, there it is. So I would like to know, where did that come from or how did that come about?
Well, that's a pretty lengthy question. Let's see if I can keep it to a minimum. But, when people do ask me, what are, if you have to distill all the things about an effective leader, what would you name? And those are the two things, self-awareness and curiosity. But if you think about it, self-awareness, so where it came from is just really a lifetime of talking with leaders and developing them over time. And of course, our own reading and writing of books. I got some of it from my father, Erwin Schinkel, who was the company founder. But really this idea of self-awareness is just, as a leader, you're not usually going to get a lot of feedback from your team. You just aren't. I mean, first of all, it's bad form if you're not a great leader or ineffective leader. In the exit interview, people aren't generally going to tell you the reason I'm quitting is because of you, and and instead they kind of fluff it off. So the leader really doesn't get confronted. So the leaders don't get high fives usually when they're doing a great job. So you're kind of left trying to process, how did this interaction, did it leave the situation better or worse? Did I get the outcome that I was looking for? And so I'm not saying you have to be overly paranoid about it or even have a total self-reflection all the time. Just pause every once in a while and say, how I handled that. Did that create the results that I was looking for? And if not, I should probably try something different. So that's the self-awareness piece. The curiosity piece is, and as you pointed out in your clip when you were talking about that, is that when you're like dealing with change or you're trying to help a person who's struggling succeed in their role, you have to kind of go with this open-mindedness, this curiosity. And curiosity always is geared towards seeking out a solution to something or not predetermining what the solution is going to be. So being curious means you're going to ask more questions. You're going to think about things a little differently. And honestly, you're also going to be prepared to change your mind. I think so many leaders are afraid to change their mind. They just don't want to be curious enough to acknowledge that maybe they didn't have the right idea to begin with.
Yeah.
Or even going into a discussion with an employee.
Yeah.
Is do I really understand why you're struggling in your role?
I also wonder if another reason is saving face or showing face. They feel as though they'll look weak and indecisive as someone that says, you know what, I've thought about it, and you're right, I've changed my opinion. And yet, I think as a team member, you want your boss to go, if I present them with good, solid information or something that I've thought through really well, or if the team has come together and decided that this thing makes more sense than the thing being proposed, anybody would want their leader to go, hey, I've contemplated, I've thought about it, you've provided me some great information, thanks for that, I've changed my mind. And so the idea of, I don't want to change my mind because I want to seem, determined and like I know what I'm talking about. It kind of goes against what we really want as team members. So there's a bit of a disconnect.
Yeah, and I think, by the way, the insecurity you can have as a leader probably lends to that. Like when we're teaching people about the idea of being defensive as a leader, and you can either be aggressively defensive, like attack, criticize, make sure nobody else can make any decisions. They always have to check with you first, or passive defensive, which is kind of trying to keep everybody happy, but not being very decisive. And I think being a good leader from a curious standpoint is just to recognize that you don't have all the answers. Your team has insights. They're closer to the work. And in fact, as a leader, especially if you're making decisions that are 2 levels lower than you got to ask yourself, how much information do you really have? Yeah, you've got a lot more experience, maybe a lot more context. You definitely have more power and authority, but that doesn't mean you should be the one who has to come up with all the solutions.
It doesn't mean you're smarter, for sure, It actually made me think of something else when you were talking about curiosity. So before we were working together, of course, you and I know each other through our connection to Rotary International. We're both members of a Rotary Club, and you were speaking at a conference, and one of the things you said that has also stuck with me for a long time is, be curious, not furious. And I say this so often, not just in my professional life, but in my personal life, that recently my husband told me that he says it to his team all the time. When you get asked something by a client that seems frustrating, be curious, not furious. Seek to understand, seek to learn. And so it's permeating all areas of my life in a good way, because I think it leads exactly to this being curious, not furious. What you said, it's so easy to be asked a question and it feels like an objection. It feels like a resistance. And that person probably is just honestly seeking clarity. And yet if you react with, being furious and why can't you just do what I say instead of questioning everything? While on the same token, I want you to do it properly and I want you to do it right. So if that means asking a few clarifying questions, I think I should want you to do that, in fact.
So I think you can relate to this, even though if you're more enlightened, like the business that we're in, I'd say, we probably know better a lot of the time. But it doesn't mean that we don't have these twinges where we get judgmental or get irritated about something. And all we mean by being curious is you want to find out what's going on and what's causing it. Yeah. And the same, like in a conflict situation, is you want to find out what's going on and you want to help them find out what's going on if it's 2 employees who are in conflict. So I just think if you take a curiosity first mindset, you're just first of all, you're going to allow more innovation, you're going to allow more involvement, you're going to have better results. So probably way better to just generally try to keep your mind as open as possible and stay curious.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate those insights. Let me tell you, they've stuck with me. So those have been gems of wisdom, nuggets of wisdom for me. So thank you for that. As we go to our next clip, our next one is from our episode we did about HR training solutions for a modern manufacturing workforce. So we were talking a little bit about kind of what does the modern manufacturing workforce look like, and how do you provide good training solutions for that. And the clip that we're going to show is, of course, about who's training your team members. And interestingly, that first clip we just talked about was about being a good teacher. And then we talked about awareness and curiosity. So interesting, I guess we're coming back to this idea of what makes a good leader. This third tip is maybe less about specifically what makes a good leader, but more about what makes a good trainer.
So say you're a really great operator. You get promoted to team lead, okay? So now you're responsible for teaching the other people on your team or the new people on your team how to operate the machinery or the equipment. That's great, but you might not be actually much of a good trainer yourself, right? I know that sounds harsh to say, but often just because you're a really good operator, it doesn't necessarily make you a good teacher. You can be a great driver. It doesn't mean you're going to be good at teaching your child how to drive, right? It takes patience, it takes cooperation, it takes understanding where they're at and where they need to be, and all of these other skills that are not necessarily anything to do with how well you operate the machine. And sometimes we make that mistake when it comes to training in general on our team. We think that the person that's best at doing a task is also the best person to train others on that task, when that's not necessarily true, right? Sometimes the most competent person at a task is maybe the worst to train because they're so good at it that they sort of go into autopilot. So if they had to walk through the steps with somebody else, they might actually go, I don't even really think about this when I'm doing it. I just do it.
Yeah. So when most clients call us up, right, they're usually saying, like, we've promoted our people from within based on being good operators, good technicians, and seen them struggle with the leadership role. And you're just highlighting again that just because you're good at something doesn't mean you're naturally able to explain it to others. And so I know in our course, when we have that module on empowerment and accountability and training, we really do focus on how do you break things down so that you can teach other people something. And I just find it a sort of a chronic issue where people, as the trainers even sometimes I think get frustrated that people aren't absorbing it just because they watch you.
Absolutely. And, keeping in mind that we picked these episodes that we did, or these clips, because these were clips that people really engage with, that they seem to enjoy, I suppose. But I think it's also because there's, like you said, if it's a chronic problem you've been seeing for, a 30 plus year career, my guess is one of the reasons it resonated with people is because they're experiencing it as well. So they're seeing this clip and going, yes, that is a struggle we deal with. I understand that sort of frustration.
So in our course, we ask things like, how do you normally train up somebody? And most people say the buddy system. And usually the follow-up question is, what are the potential pitfalls or flaws with the buddy system? And it really just reveals what you were talking about in that clip. And then what we want people to know, and sometimes we even get asked to only deliver some content to help people's internal trainers do better on the job training so that they are more successful. And sorry, I'm going to take that one step further to say that a lot of organizations are dealing with this turnover because of retirements and coming out of the COVID pandemic. People decided to retire, and so companies have lost a lot of talent and skills on their teams. And so we do need to get people to be more competent. And, one of the things I always think, if you're going to be an effective trainer, the results of your training or the effectiveness of it is to the degree that the person could perform the job task fairly well and independently.
I think to what we were talking about earlier with accountability and with empowerment, those go hand in hand with training, which is, of course, why in our module we call it empowerment, accountability, and training. Because if you're planning to empower, if you're a leader that wants more people on your team to be able to do more things, it's all well and good for me to say, you know what, Greg? Yeah, you go ahead and try that. Good luck. Or, yeah, I empower you to do that. But really what you need to think about is, do they have the knowledge or skills to do that? And if they don't, training is the first step. Training kind of has to happen almost before empowerment, because I don't want to, in a way, empower someone to say, yeah, go for it. They're inevitably going to maybe struggle or, not succeed. And that's going to lead to potential frustration. It's going to lead to maybe them not wanting to push further.
Yeah, or you're going to end up taking back the task.
As the leader, you don't want to do that.
And then you're going to think, well, the people just aren't capable. So I think you're raising a good point. So the training of people is actually, I will say that in a lot of employee surveys, and certainly if anyone listening is part of human resources, learning and development, or part of an executive team in an operational environment, you probably see these survey results and they say that people don't feel that they've been adequately trained. And I know a lot of, HR people almost get defensive at that point and go, well, I delivered hours and hours of training, or we definitely gave them a lot of training. And I just don't think that the training is as effective, and it's not measured in the number of hours. It's not the activity, it's the outcome of the activity.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it comes even to performance. Like if you have metrics of what you're trying to achieve and you're saying they should be able to do this, then like you said, it's not about the number of hours they took to train. It's can they do this task or not, and can they do it to the level of proficiency that we need them to do it to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish.
I mean, just think about the education system. A lot of times it's like we're going to take 100 hours of classroom time to teach you mathematics or history or geography. And it's like, but what is the proficiency at the end of it, right? Can the person identify places on a map for geography? Can they Can they identify key historical events and understand their relevance on today,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what is the outcome of what we're teaching people? And I think from a training perspective, it's probably very easy.
Yeah.
It's can they perform the job safely and to the quality level, speed, and efficiency that we need as an operation.
Absolutely. I also wonder, as maybe a final point on that, when it comes to training, I find training tends to be concentrated at the very beginning of someone's tenure or at the beginning of them being given a task. And I don't see a lot of either organizations or systems wherein there's a check-in after a month or 6 weeks, or depending on the task, to say, hey, I know you got the basics down. Have you come across situations or scenarios that maybe didn't fit what we initially trained you on, that you have questions about now, to continue furthering their training and their competency and their ability in that particular task?
So you raise a good point, which is good news. We gave you training 25 years ago. And then we introduced a whole lot of automation and process refinement and lean and continuous improvement. And we never really gave you enough adequate training after that. Or as we see in our clients, the supervisors are promoted from within and they're not given any training. I think the one stat I came across said that the average leader or supervisor in an operations environment waits 13 years for their first training program. We wonder why they're struggling on some of these things.
That's right. And of course, in our training, we ask some polling questions because we like to get, first of all, the information's interesting, but we also like that engagement. And one of the questions we ask is, how much leadership training have you had? Right after, we ask, how long have you been in a leadership role? And that's, I think that stat you're mentioning would probably align with our results, where, we like to make a joke if people say that it's their first leadership training. We, of course, like to make the joke that, well, it's the best you've ever had in that case. But it is a little scary sometimes to see, maybe not scary, but worrying that we have these people that have been in a leadership role for 5, 10, maybe even a year. Like, maybe it's not about always a decade of these huge numbers, but they've been in a role for a year and they have yet to really get much initial training. And it comes back to one of our big problems, which is people are often hired because of good technical skills. And of course, being a leader, one of the biggest things you taught me is that being a leader is not about your individual results or capacity. It's about being able to get results through your team. And that's just such a different ballgame. So with the last clip we want to look at today was also from the impact of effective leadership on manufacturing performance, which is where our curiosity and self-awareness clip came from. But it was another really popular clip, and I think after we watch the clip, I think we'll see why.
So there has to be a little bit of give and take. I get that someone might feel nervous. I get that someone might feel, especially if it's the first time you're ever really asking for feedback in that way. I get that it can feel a little bit awkward and a bit difficult. But I think if you're making the effort to ask them, then you're already taking that first step. And subsequent meetings, I think that consistency of continually saying, I want to be a better leader, what can I do? Eventually, even if they were hesitant at first, I think they're going to go, oh, they're actually serious about this, especially when they see the feedback that they give get implemented, right? So if they give feedback that, hey, I sometimes feel like you're not telling us stuff early enough. I feel like we find out things maybe a little bit at the last minute. I'd appreciate a bit more info earlier on. If you then follow through with that, then they're far more likely to probably give you more honest and even more feedback next time, because they're going, oh, they actually took what I said and applied it, which is fantastic.
So you know what, I love that clip because you're looking at this idea of performance and involvement, and so again, I think leaders really struggle with this idea of, if I ask people for their ideas and then I don't use them, that's going to be negative. And so what's your thought on that?
Well, I think the best thing you can do is ask. And I think we talk about the coach, a good coach involves the team and clarifies expectations. And I think it's okay to involve the team if you're going to clarify expectations. So it comes back to, hey, I appreciate your feedback. I appreciate your ideas. We may not be able to implement everything. I think that transparency is important. But I also think it's a bit of explaining why. So if you're not going to implement something, I think people just want to know why, and not a why. Well, it's just a bad idea, Greg. It's kind of a crap idea. You shouldn't have said it in the first place. Instead, it's more like, these are our priorities as a department or as an organization, and therefore these are the ideas that we feel maybe align best with that, or this is what I'm capable of accomplishing. So I think if you can provide the reason why you are asking for feedback, and then the reason why you maybe can't go ahead with certain feedback, I think people will respect that you asked, even if you're not necessarily going to implement every idea or suggestion that they come back with.
Right. So I think that's great, because it's funny, you talk about clarifying expectations. You're doing that even around asking for feedback. Here's what you can expect. Here's what we're doing with that. The other thing I think that managers could probably do a better job of is explaining some of the, I mean, you said explaining why, but even just the criteria that they use for deciding what projects to green light and what projects maybe to put off. You know, a lot of it has to do with how expensive, if there's capital dollars, like we're going to have to make an investment, that often has to wait till there's a budget. You know, it's the payback from that investment. It could be how fast we can get it implemented or how many resources are needed to get it implemented. And just our sense of whether is it going to really generate the results that we're looking for or is it not. I think a lot of finance people inside these manufacturing and supply chain and warehouse operations could probably say they have a desk drawer of, you know, supposed savings that just never really materialized. So not every idea is at the right time in the right place for that organization.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned that idea of alignment, right? There might be an idea that makes sense for a department or for a team, but that employee, because they, you know, we've talked about, you know, as an employee, you do live a little bit in a bubble, especially in a bigger company. You're not necessarily kind of clicked on with the rest of the organization. And partly that's because sometimes organizations are just so big that, of course, these little sub kind of cultures or societies get created. But I think it's also sometimes the organization maybe doesn't do a great job of aligning and sharing that alignment and what we're looking for at a high level as an organization. So I think it's very normal that on a smaller scale within your team or department, you have an idea that makes perfect sense to the team or department. You go, yeah, this should be done this way. It makes sense that way. And yet on a bigger scale, at a bigger level, when you look at it, it's maybe not the best idea. And as a leader, sometimes you have that visibility. So then it's up to you to help them understand why, from a bigger picture perspective, that particular idea isn't gonna fly.
So you think about that. It brings up a couple of ideas. One is that the leader may not know themselves, right? Or everyone is so compartmentalized, like you said, in a large company, they don't know the domino effect of whatever that change might have on another department, or what might it need from a previous department in terms of getting an input. So what that means is that the leader needs to go, let's say, to the management team if they're going to bring forward an idea or a concern, and then they do hear this rationale. They need to remember to come back with that information to their team, as opposed to, well, I tried and they just said no.
They shut it down.
And I think that's just what, again, causes employees to say, well, they just don't care about us. And, you know, that does remind me, by the way, earlier in my career, I worked at General Motors and we had a foundry operation. And I remember I'm just a young co-op student, right, in the industrial engineering department. And I went out on the floor and I go, you know, this guy was particularly sour, but I knew he had worked there for a long time. And I go, you know, why is kind of so negative about the company? He says, well, I'll tell you why. And this was like around 1986 or 1987. He goes, back in 1973, I raised a concern and a suggestion, and I'm still waiting to hear back. And I'm like going, you know, well, first of all, you shouldn't hold grudges that long, everybody. But it just showed you. And by the way, anybody who's worked in a sort of what I would call the old school type factory can probably relate to that comment. Like people hold grudges for a long time because the leader doesn't close the loop and get back to them.
Absolutely. And maybe, unfortunately, I think an older style of leadership was a leader being able to say, I hire you to work, not to think. And that was kind of an acceptable way to say. But at the end of the day, you can tell someone that, but it doesn't mean they feel good that their idea isn't being, you know, brought up the chain or considered. Like you could tell people whatever you want, but how they feel is still how they feel. So despite that being sort of maybe the zeitgeist of that time, where it was, you're just here to work, you're not here to think, and just do your job, doesn't mean he doesn't feel left out or excluded for having what he thought was a good idea and getting no feedback on it.
Yeah, and that scarring can last a long time when and cause disengagement when somebody is dismissed like that. So I think that's an excellent point, that we have to get better at listening and explaining things because we're on one team. Yeah. It's not and that phrase that you said, we don't pay you to think, we pay you to work. That has been uttered more than once. And I just think managers and leaders just need to understand what you're telling somebody is your level of engagement is not required here. Please push the button and run the machine. And you're forgetting that people are human beings. Yeah. So just something to be careful with.
And interestingly, I don't think people tend to suggest ideas that are going to, you know, lower productivity, lower inefficiency, effectiveness, lower safety, or lower engagement, because people generally, I think, want to be engaged in their job. I mean, of course, there's a few outliers in any scenario. There's people that are there just for the money and they don't care. But most people, I think, have some level of, I want to feel like I'm part of something. I want to feel like I contribute. I want to understand the value of that contribution. So when they're suggesting ideas, they're, like I said, they're seldom suggesting something to purposely make the company perform worse or purposely make them do a worse job. So it's worth it to perk your ears up. We've talked about curiosity in this episode a fair bit, but it's worth perking your ears up and going, I'm sure there's something to this. And even if it's not implementable, saying, I appreciate that you're thinking. I appreciate that you're clicked in, because that's a really big thing when we look at engagement surveys with clients we work with. That's often a thing where they're going, how do we get people to be more engaged? Yeah. And I think you hint at that, which is listen to them when they have ideas.
Yeah, so it does remind me of an episode of Accelerating Operational Performance, and we have Dawn Marie Turner on one of the episodes, and she's a change leadership expert, and she talks about change readiness. And what she says is a lot of times management teams also kind of wait a very long time before they release information to the group, kind of wanting to make sure it's well thought out. And of course, it is important to have it well thought out. Mm-hmm. But just think about that. If a management team has been wrestling with something for weeks or months or sometimes years, and then they go to release it onto the factory floor only to be a surprise, this is something we've already decided. And meanwhile, the people who are going to be involved in doing that have had no level of even thinking about it or processing it. Mm-hmm. And what Dr. Dawn Marie Turner says in that episode is we really should involve people in change much earlier and trust the fact that they are grown, mature people. Mm-hmm. And like you said, you're going to have a few outliers that are going to make it frustrating. And I think, by the way, a lot of leaders take those couple of outliers and use that as a reason to just shut down all these things. And that is not what you should do. Remember, most of the people want to do a good job, a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. They care about the company's success. And if you treat them that way, you're going to get better results. Yeah. And so I think this look back has been so awesome. Mm-hmm, yeah. This has been the look back on the Leader Feeder podcast that Suzanne Jakes, our marketing coordinator, does with Kirk Langford, our general manager. Again, we just invite you to subscribe. And again, in the show notes, we've got all the links to these episodes. Mm-hmm. We hope that you'll go back in the back library or the back episodes and start listening to some of them. And of course, I'm here on the Accelerating Operational Performance podcast. So for now, we just want to wish you well on your leadership journey.